Welcome back to Crimson Threads, the channel that unravels the darkest stories hidden in plain sight. In today's episode, we delve into a case that shatters the idyllic image of suburban life. A story of a mother's love twisted into a monstrous jealousy that culminates in an act so heinous, it will leave you questioning the very nature of family. Before we pull back the curtain on this backyard horror, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, so you never miss an investigation into the shadows of the human heart. Now, settle in as we uncover the chilling tale of a mother-in-law, a doting grandmother who became a cold-blooded killer to protect a secret she would take to the grave. The scent of freshly cut grass and blooming hydrangeas usually filled the air on Sycamore Lane, a picture-perfect street in the heart of suburbia. White picket fences stood as silent sentinels to manicured lawns and homes that whispered tales of happy families. The Miller household, nestled at number 12, was the epitome of this idyllic dream. From the outside, it was a Rockwell painting come to life. A charming two-story house with a welcoming porch swing and a meticulously tended garden. But behind the closed doors of this seemingly perfect home, a darkness was taking root, a malignant seed of resentment and deceit that would soon blossom into an unimaginable horror. At the heart of the Miller family was Eleanor Miller, a woman in her late 50s with a smile that could charm the birds from the trees and a will of iron that could bend steel. A widow for the past decade, Eleanor had poured all her energy into her only son, David. Her love for him was a fierce, all-consuming fire, a love that left little room for anyone else. When David brought home Clara, a vibrant and kind-hearted young woman with a passion for art and a laugh that was as infectious as her spirit, Eleanor had welcomed her with open arms, or so it seemed. The wedding was a grand affair, a testament to Eleanor's generosity and her desire to give her son the very best. Clara, an orphan who had yearned for a family her whole life, was initially overwhelmed by Eleanor's attentiveness. The older woman was a constant presence, offering advice on everything from cooking to decorating. At first, Clara saw it as a blessing, a mother's guidance she had never had. But as the months turned into years, the gentle suggestions began to feel like dictates, the helpful advice a constant critique. Eleanor's presence in their home became less of a comfort and more of a suffocating blanket. David, blinded by a lifetime of devotion to his mother, saw only her love and support. "She's just trying to help, honey," he would say, his words a gentle dismissal of Clara's growing unease. The birth of their son, Leo, a beautiful boy with his mother's bright eyes and his father's charming smile, should have been a joyous occasion that brought the family closer together. Instead, it only served to amplify the underlying tensions. Eleanor's focus shifted from David to her grandson, her love for the child bordering on obsession. She showered him with extravagant gifts, undermining Clara's more modest and practical approach to parenting. She would disregard Clara's rules, feeding Leo sugary treats before dinner and letting him stay up past his bedtime. Any attempt by Clara to assert her authority as a mother was met with a passive-aggressive remark from Eleanor, a subtle jab that painted Clara as ungrateful and overbearing. "Oh, let the boy have a little fun," Eleanor would say with a saccharine smile, her eyes holding a glint of something cold and calculating. "You're so strict with him, dear. Children need a little spoiling now and then." Clara found herself increasingly isolated in her own home. David, working long hours at a demanding law firm, was often oblivious to the subtle power struggle playing out between his wife and his mother. When Clara did try to voice her frustrations, he would accuse her of being overly sensitive, of imagining slights where there were none. "My mother adores you and Leo," he would insist, his voice laced with a weary impatience. "Can't you just try to get along?" The once loving and passionate connection between Clara and David began to fray at the edges. Their conversations became strained, their nights filled with a tense silence. Clara found solace in her art, her paintbrush and canvas her only true confidants. She poured her anxieties and fears onto the canvas, creating abstract and often turbulent pieces that mirrored the turmoil in her heart. Her studio, a small sunroom at the back of the house, became her sanctuary, the one place where she could breathe freely, away from the suffocating presence of her mother-in-law. But even there, she was not safe from Eleanor's intrusions. The older woman would often appear at the door, a cup of tea in hand, her eyes scanning Clara's latest work with a critical gaze. "It's interesting, dear," she would say, her tone implying that interesting was a far cry from good. "I'm not sure I understand all this modern art. So chaotic." The chaos, however, was not on the canvas but in the very fabric of their lives. Eleanor's control extended beyond the home. She had an uncanny ability to manipulate situations to her advantage, to isolate Clara from her friends and the few remaining relatives she had. A planned weekend trip with friends would be sabotaged by a sudden illness that required David's constant attention. A visit from Clara's aunt would be overshadowed by Eleanor's elaborate and overwhelming hospitality, leaving Clara feeling like a guest in her own home. As Leo grew from a baby into a toddler, Eleanor's possessiveness intensified. She began to refer to him as "my boy," her words a subtle but constant reminder to Clara of her perceived secondary role in her son's life. She would dress him in clothes she had bought, ignoring the outfits Clara had carefully chosen. She would tell him stories of the Miller family history, of a lineage that Clara was a part of only by marriage, an outsider in a world of shared blood and memories. The breaking point for Clara came on Leo's 3rd birthday. She had spent weeks planning the perfect party, a small gathering of his friends from daycare with a superhero theme, his latest obsession. She had baked a cake, decorated the house with colorful streamers, and put together party favors for each child. But on the morning of the party, Eleanor announced that she had invited her own friends, a group of women from her bridge club, to celebrate Leo's coming of age. "It's never too early to introduce him to proper society, dear," Eleanor had said, her smile as brittle as spun sugar. "And a superhero theme is so common. I've taken the liberty of ordering a more traditional cake and some more appropriate decorations." Clara was stunned into silence. Her carefully planned party had been hijacked, her efforts dismissed as childish and unsophisticated. When she tried to protest, to explain that this was a party for a 3-year-old, not a society luncheon, Eleanor had simply patted her hand and said, "Don't you worry your pretty little head about it. I'll take care of everything." David, as usual, had sided with his mother. "She's just trying to make it special, Clara. Why do you always have to be so difficult?" That night, after the last of Eleanor's friends had departed, leaving behind a trail of polite compliments and a mountain of washing up, Clara confronted David. The simmering resentment that had been building for years finally boiled over. "I can't do this anymore, David," she had said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and despair. "It's me or your mother. You have to choose." The ultimatum hung in the air between them, a stark and undeniable turning point in their marriage. For the first time, David saw the depth of his wife's unhappiness, the pain that had been hidden behind her forced smiles and quiet acquiescence. He loved Clara, he truly did, but the thought of confronting his mother, of disrupting the carefully constructed world she had built around him, filled him with a paralyzing fear. He promised to talk to her, to set boundaries, to make things right. But his words lacked conviction, his promises a hollow echo of a love that was being slowly eroded by the toxic influence of his mother. Clara knew then that nothing would change, that she was trapped in a gilded cage, a beautiful home that had become her prison. Little did she know, the walls of that prison were about to become a tomb. The secret that Eleanor harbored, the one that fueled her desperate need for control, was a dark and twisted one. It was a secret that had been buried for years, a skeleton in the family closet that she would do anything to keep hidden. Her late husband, a man revered by all who knew him as a pillar of the community, had a hidden life, a secret family in a neighboring town. Eleanor had discovered his betrayal shortly before his death from a sudden heart attack, a death that had left her with a mountain of debt and a heart full of a bitter, all-consuming rage. She had spent years carefully rebuilding her life, crafting an image of a grieving but resilient widow, a devoted mother and grandmother. The Miller name, once a source of pride, had become a fragile facade that she had to protect at all costs. The secret of her husband's infidelity and the existence of his other family was a ticking time bomb, one that she feared could destroy everything she had worked so hard to maintain. Clara, with her inquisitive nature and her refusal to be cowed by Eleanor's domineering personality, was a threat. She asked too many questions, she was too independent, too perceptive. Eleanor saw in Clara a reflection of the other woman, the one who had stolen her husband's love and sullied the family name. Her resentment towards Clara was not just about control. It was a twisted form of revenge, a transference of her hatred for her late husband's mistress onto her innocent daughter-in-law. The day of Leo's party had been a turning point for Eleanor as well. Clara's defiance, an open challenge to her authority, had ignited a spark of fear in the older woman's heart. She saw Clara not just as an obstacle to her control over Leo, but as a potential threat to her carefully constructed world. What if Clara discovered her secret? What if she exposed the lie that was the Miller family legacy? The thought was a venom that coursed through her veins, poisoning her mind and twisting her love for her grandson into a possessive, all-consuming obsession. Leo was a Miller, a part of the legacy she was so desperate to protect. He was her blood, her future. Clara, in her eyes, was an outsider, a threat that needed to be eliminated. The seeds of a monstrous plan had been sown. As she stood in the kitchen that night, washing the last of the party dishes, her reflection in the darkened window showed a woman with a placid smile, but her eyes held a chilling emptiness, a void where a conscience should have been. The perfect facade of Sycamore Lane was about to be shattered, and the backyard of the Miller home, a place of innocent childhood games and summer barbecues, would soon become a stage for a horror beyond anyone's imagination. The scent of hydrangeas would soon be replaced by the stench of death, and the whispers of happy families would be drowned out by the screams of a tragedy that would haunt the idyllic street forever. The day after Leo's ill-fated birthday party, a heavy, oppressive silence descended upon the Miller house. The colorful streamers and deflated balloons, remnants of a celebration that had been anything but joyous, seemed to mock the palpable tension that filled the air. Clara moved through the house like a ghost, her face pale and drawn, her eyes clouded with a weary resignation. Her conversation with David the night before had left her feeling more hopeless than ever. His promises to talk to his mother felt like empty platitudes, a desperate attempt to placate her without actually confronting the root of the problem. David, for his part, was a man torn. He loved his wife, and the sight of her so unhappy filled him with a gnawing guilt. But the thought of standing up to his mother, of shattering the illusion of their perfect family, was a prospect he found terrifying. He left for work that morning with a heavy heart, the unresolved conflict at home, a dark cloud that followed him throughout the day. Eleanor, on the other hand, was a picture of serene composure. She moved about the house with a quiet efficiency, her face a mask of gentle concern. She prepared a lavish breakfast, her cheerful chatter a stark contrast to the strained silence between Clara and David. She fussed over Leo, her doting grandmother act now laced with a chilling undercurrent of possessiveness. To an outside observer, she was the epitome of a loving matriarch, the glue that held the family together. But to Clara, her every gesture, every word, was a carefully calculated move in a silent war of attrition. That afternoon, while Leo was napping, Clara retreated to her studio, the one place where she could find a semblance of peace. She stared at a blank canvas, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She knew she couldn't continue to live like this, a prisoner in her own home, her identity slowly being erased by her overbearing mother-in-law. The thought of leaving David, of taking Leo and starting over, was a terrifying one, but the alternative, a life of quiet desperation, was even more so. As she picked up a paintbrush, her hand trembling slightly, she heard the soft creak of the studio door. Eleanor stood in the doorway, a tray with a cup of chamomile tea and a plate of freshly baked cookies in her hands. "I thought you might like a little something to help you relax, dear," she said, her voice a soothing balm that did little to calm the storm raging inside Clara. "You've been so on edge lately." Clara forced a tight-lipped smile. "Thank you, Eleanor. That's very thoughtful of you." Eleanor set the tray down on a small table and then, instead of leaving, she began to wander around the studio, her eyes scrutinizing Clara's artwork. "You know, dear," she began, her tone casual but her words carefully chosen. "I've been thinking. Perhaps a little getaway would do you some good. A few days at a spa, perhaps? Just to clear your head. I'd be more than happy to look after Leo." The suggestion, on the surface, seemed like a kind and generous offer. But Clara heard the unspoken message behind the words. "Go away. Leave Leo with me." The thought of being separated from her son, of leaving him in the care of a woman she was beginning to fear, sent a chill down her spine. "I don't think so, Eleanor," she said, her voice firmer than she had intended. "I don't need a getaway. I need for things to change here, in this house." Eleanor's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes hardening before she quickly regained her composure. "Of course, dear. Whatever you think is best." She turned to leave, but then paused at the door. "Oh, by the way," she said, her voice once again light and airy, "I've started a new compost pile in the backyard by the old oak tree. I'm trying to be more environmentally conscious. You should see it sometime." The seemingly innocuous comment would later take on a sinister and horrifying significance. At the time, however, Clara paid it little mind, her thoughts consumed by the ever-worsening situation in her home. The next few days were a blur of forced politeness and simmering resentments. David, true to his word, had a talk with his mother, a conversation that, from what Clara could gather, had been little more than a gentle suggestion that she give Clara some space. The result was a subtle shift in Eleanor's tactics. She was no longer overtly critical, but her disapproval was now conveyed through withering glances and pointed silences. She became a martyr, sighing dramatically as she did the housework, her every action a silent accusation that Clara was lazy and ungrateful. The breaking point, the final, irrevocable act that would set in motion a chain of events so horrific it would defy comprehension, came on a sweltering afternoon in late August. Clara had received a call from a gallery in the city. They had seen her work online and were interested in featuring some of her pieces in an upcoming exhibition. It was the break she had been dreaming of, a validation of her talent and a potential escape from the suffocating confines of her life. She was ecstatic, her heart soaring with a hope she hadn't felt in years. She rushed to tell David, but he was in a meeting and didn't answer his phone. She then went to find Eleanor, a part of her still clinging to the naive hope that her mother-in-law would share in her joy. She found her in the backyard, tending to her rose bushes, her face a mask of serene concentration. When Clara told her the news, Eleanor's reaction was not what she had expected. There was no smile, no word of congratulation. Instead, a flicker of something dark and unsettling crossed her face, a fleeting expression of what looked like a mixture of anger and fear. "An art gallery?" Eleanor said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "In the city? That's a long way to go every day. What about Leo? Who will look after him?" "I'll work it out, Eleanor," Clara said, her initial excitement now tempered by a familiar sense of frustration. "I can get a nanny, or maybe we can find a daycare in the city. This is a huge opportunity for me." "An opportunity to neglect your family, you mean?" Eleanor retorted, her voice dripping with scorn. "Your place is here at home with your son, not gallivanting around the city with a bunch of pretentious artists." The words, so full of venom and contempt, struck Clara like a physical blow. The last vestiges of her hope for a peaceful resolution crumbled. "You have no right to say that to me," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You have no right to dictate my life. I am a mother, yes, but I am also a person, an artist, and I will not let you take that away from me." The confrontation that followed was a storm of accusations and recriminations, years of pent-up anger and resentment finally erupting in a torrent of bitter words. The argument escalated, moving from the backyard into the house, their raised voices echoing through the empty rooms. Leo, awakened from his nap by the shouting, began to cry, his wails adding a new layer of distress to the already chaotic scene. Clara, her heart breaking for her frightened child, tried to end the argument, to retreat to the safety of her son's room. But Eleanor blocked her path, her face contorted in a mask of pure fury. "You will not take him from me?" she hissed, her voice a low and menacing growl. He is a Miller. He belongs here. In that moment, Clara saw a side of her mother-in-law she had never seen before, a glimpse of the madness that lurked beneath the surface of her carefully constructed facade. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her anger. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that she and Leo were not safe in this house. She grabbed Leo, holding him close to her chest, his small body trembling with sobs. "We're leaving, David and I," she said, her voice a desperate whisper. "We're leaving this house, and we're leaving you." The words, a declaration of her intent to take away the two people Eleanor loved most in the world, were the final, fatal spark that ignited the inferno of her rage. The carefully controlled mask of the doting grandmother shattered, revealing the monster that lay beneath. What happened next would forever be a blur in the annals of criminal history, a sequence of events so brutal and senseless that it would leave even the most seasoned investigators shaken. The details of the murders, the cold and calculated manner in which they were carried out, would later be pieced together through a painstaking investigation. But the one thing that was certain was that on that hot August afternoon, a mother and her child disappeared from the face of the earth. When David returned home from work that evening, he found the house eerily quiet. There was no sign of Clara or Leo. A half-finished painting sat on the easel in Clara's studio, the vibrant colors a stark contrast to the ominous silence that filled the house. He called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried her friends, her aunt, but no one had seen or heard from her. He found his mother in the kitchen, humming a cheerful tune as she prepared dinner. When he asked where Clara and Leo were, she simply shrugged and said, "She left, David. She took Leo and she left. She said she couldn't live like this anymore." Her words, delivered with a calm and convincing sincerity, planted a seed of doubt in David's mind. Had Clara finally followed through on her threat? Had the pressure of their life together, the constant conflict with his mother, finally become too much for her to bear? For 2 days, David clung to the belief that Clara had simply left, that she would eventually call, that they could work things out. But as the hours turned into days, a gnawing sense of unease began to take hold. It wasn't like Clara to just disappear, to not even call to let him know that she and Leo were safe. He called the police, his voice laced with a growing panic. The initial investigation was slow to get off the ground. A young woman and her child leaving after a domestic dispute was not an uncommon occurrence. The police treated it as a missing persons case, but there was no sense of urgency. It was a neighbor, a retired man who spent his days tending to his garden, who provided the first clue that something was terribly wrong. He told the police that he had heard a loud and heated argument coming from the Miller house on the afternoon Clara and Leo had disappeared. He had also seen something else, something that had struck him as odd at the time. He had seen Eleanor in the backyard, late that night, standing by the new compost pile, her face illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. She had been holding a shovel. The compost pile. The seemingly innocuous comment Eleanor had made to Clara a few days earlier now took on a sinister and horrifying meaning. The police, their suspicions now aroused, obtained a warrant to search the Miller property. What they found in the backyard, buried beneath a shallow layer of dirt and decomposing leaves, was a scene of unimaginable horror. The bodies of Clara and Leo, wrapped in plastic sheeting, had been hastily buried in the compost pile. The cause of death was later determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. The idyllic suburban dream of Sycamore Lane had been shattered, replaced by a waking nightmare. The white picket fences now seemed to mock the darkness that had been lurking behind the closed doors of the Miller house. The scent of hydrangeas was now mingled with the stench of death and decay. And the woman who had once been seen as the perfect mother and grandmother was now the prime suspect in a double homicide investigation. The unraveling had just begun. The discovery in the backyard of the Miller home sent shockwaves through the quiet community of Sycamore Lane and beyond. The idyllic image of the perfect suburban family was brutally torn apart, replaced by a grim and horrifying reality. The house at number 12, once a symbol of domestic bliss, was now a gruesome crime scene, cordoned off with yellow police tape that fluttered in the late summer breeze like a macabre warning. David Miller, a man already grappling with the fear and confusion of his wife and son's disappearance, was now plunged into the depths of a nightmare from which he would never fully awaken. The news that their bodies had been found, and the location of their discovery, was a blow so devastating it shattered his world into a million irreparable pieces. His grief was a raw, all-consuming agony, a pain so profound it was almost physical. But his sorrow was soon to be compounded by a betrayal so monstrous, so unthinkable, that it would defy all reason. Eleanor Miller, the doting grandmother, the loving mother, was taken in for questioning. She went willingly, her face a mask of bewildered innocence. She played the part of the grieving matriarch to perfection, her eyes welling with tears as she spoke of her love for Clara and Leo, her voice trembling with a convincing display of sorrow. She stuck to her story. Clara had left after their argument, taking Leo with her. She had no idea what had happened to them. She insisted, her words a picture of heartbroken denial. But the evidence against her was mounting. The neighbor's testimony about the argument and her late-night activities in the backyard was a crucial piece of the puzzle. A search of the house revealed traces of blood in Clara's studio, blood that was later confirmed to be a match for both Clara and Leo. And then there was the murder weapon, a heavy, ornate statue from the living room mantelpiece, found cleaned and back in its place, but with microscopic traces of blood and hair that tied it to the crime. The detectives assigned to the case, a seasoned duo who had seen their fair share of human depravity, were not fooled by Eleanor's convincing performance. They saw the flicker of calculation in her eyes, the subtle inconsistencies in her story, the chilling lack of genuine emotion beneath the layers of feigned grief. They knew they were dealing with a cunning and manipulative killer, a woman who had gone to great lengths to conceal her horrific crime. For days, they interrogated her, their questions a relentless barrage of a carefully constructed web of lies. They presented her with the evidence, the bloodstains, the neighbor's testimony, the murder weapon. But she remained unyielding, her denials as firm and unshakable as a granite wall. She twisted the facts, she manipulated the timeline, she even tried to cast suspicion on David, suggesting that his grief was a cover for a guilty conscience. But the detectives were patient. They knew that a killer like Eleanor, a woman driven by a desperate need for control, would eventually make a mistake. Her carefully constructed facade would crack under the pressure. Her arrogance would betray her. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While searching through Eleanor's financial records, investigators uncovered a secret that she had guarded for years, the very secret that had been the catalyst for her monstrous act. They discovered the existence of her late husband's secret family, the illegitimate child he had fathered, the years of financial support he had provided them, a betrayal that had left Eleanor on the brink of financial ruin. They confronted her with this new information, and for the first time, they saw a flicker of genuine emotion in her eyes. Fear. Her carefully constructed world, the legacy she had fought so hard to protect, was crumbling around her. "Your husband's other family, Eleanor," the lead detective said, his voice calm and steady. "They're going to contest the will. They want their share of the Miller estate. The estate you've worked so hard to preserve." The words hung in the air, a stark and undeniable truth that stripped away the last of her defenses. The motive, the missing piece of the puzzle, was finally clear. It wasn't just about control, it was about money, about preserving the illusion of the perfect Miller family, a legacy that was built on a foundation of lies. Clara, with her plans to leave, to take David and Leo with her, had been a threat not just to Eleanor's control over her family, but to her financial security. If David left, if he was no longer a part of the Miller household, the carefully constructed facade of their perfect family would be shattered. The secrets of the past would be exposed. The legacy she had fought so hard to protect would be destroyed. The detective continued, his voice relentless. "Clara knew, didn't she? Or you were afraid she would find out. That's why you had to get rid of her. She was a threat to your perfect little world, a world built on a foundation of secrets and lies." The dam of Eleanor's denial finally broke. The carefully constructed facade of the grieving grandmother crumbled, revealing the cold, calculating monster that lay beneath. The tears she shed now were not of sorrow, but of a bitter, self-pitying rage. Her confession, when it finally came, was a chilling and remorseless account of a crime so brutal it defied comprehension. She recounted the events of that hot August afternoon with a disturbing and matter-of-fact detachment, her voice devoid of any emotion. She described the argument with Clara, the final, fatal confrontation that had pushed her over the edge. She spoke of her fear, her rage, her desperate need to protect the life she had so carefully constructed. In her twisted mind, Clara was no longer her daughter-in-law. She was an obstacle, a threat that had to be eliminated. She confessed to grabbing the statue from the mantelpiece, to following Clara into her studio, to striking her from behind with a force born of years of pent-up rage and resentment. And then, in a final act of unimaginable cruelty, she had turned her rage on her own grandson, the little boy she had claimed to love more than life itself. Leo, a witness to his mother's murder, had to be silenced. His death, she explained with a chillingly logical detachment, was a necessity, a loose end that had to be tied up. She described how she had wrapped their bodies in plastic sheeting, how she had dragged them out to the backyard under the cover of darkness, how she had buried them in the compost pile, a place she had so casually mentioned to Clara just days before. She had cleaned the crime scene with a meticulous and chilling efficiency, her every action a testament to her cold and calculating nature. There was no remorse in her confession, no flicker of guilt or regret. In her mind, she was the victim, a woman driven to an unthinkable act by the betrayal of her husband and the defiance of her daughter-in-law. She had done what she had to do, she insisted, to protect her family, to preserve the Miller name. The confession sent a new wave of shock and revulsion through the community. The story of the backyard horror of Sycamore Lane became a national headline, a cautionary tale of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most seemingly perfect lives. David Miller, a man already broken by grief, was now forced to confront the unimaginable truth. The woman he had loved and trusted his entire life, his own mother, was a cold-blooded killer. The betrayal was a wound so deep, so profound, it would never fully heal. He was left to navigate a world that had been stripped of all its certainties, a world where the lines between love and hate, good and evil, had been irrevocably blurred. The trial of Eleanor Miller was a media sensation. The courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators, all eager to catch a glimpse of the woman who had become known as the grandmother from hell. She sat through the proceedings with a stoic and defiant demeanor, her face a mask of cold indifference. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The confession, the physical evidence, the testimony of her neighbors and her own son, all painted a damning portrait of a woman who was not a grieving grandmother, but a ruthless and manipulative killer. The jury's verdict was swift and unanimous. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, in his sentencing, spoke of the unfathomable and monstrous nature of her crimes, of a betrayal of a sacred trust that had shaken the very foundations of the community. Eleanor Miller was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was sent to a maximum security facility, a place where she would spend the rest of her days surrounded by the cold, hard reality of the life she had chosen. The legacy she had fought so hard to protect was now one of infamy, the Miller name forever synonymous with a backyard horror that would be whispered about for generations to come. The house on Sycamore Lane was eventually sold, its new owners unaware of the dark secrets that were buried in its past. But for the community, for the families who had been touched by the tragedy, the memory of what happened at number 12 would forever be a scar on their collective conscience. A chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones we least expect, the ones who hide in plain sight, behind a smile, a kind word, and the perfect, deadly facade of love.